I titled today's mind map, our Neville Goddard conversation, Feel the Reality of the Idea. Now, one of the pinnacle aspects of our recent conversation is the letting go of external opinions, knowing that there's actually only one suggester within ourselves. And in regards to external opinions, whatever we interpret, we are still the only interpreter and thus can allow ourselves to think and believe to be true that which we experience, and thus we form our own conclusions within ourselves. Now, we want to relate this over to the idea of harmonious relationships. I've received a number of emails, and through a number of conversations, I've realized that the topic of relationships, when it comes to initiating a relationship and building relationships, tends to be one of the important aspects for a person's well-being, life, how they want to experience reality. And so today we want to tie this into the understanding of self-persuasion. We're focusing on changing ourselves, and as we discussed last Sunday, we change ourselves and others change. Today I want to discuss this from the perspective of rejection, which is really self-rejection. We're going to look at this word rejection, which, again, they're forming their own interpretations in relation to. And from there, bringing forth certain reactivity or experiences in which they form conclusions and thus suggest to themselves. Now, this quote here articulates it really well, what we really want. Now, Neville states, Blake, in his wonderful Marriage of Heaven and Hell, said, I dined with Isaiah and Ezekiel and asked, does a strong persuasion that a thing is so make it so? And Isaiah replied, all prophets believe it does. And in ages of imagination, a firm persuasion moved mountains. But many today are not capable of a firm persuasion of anything. Everything here was once only a desire believed. This building, the clothes you wear, or the car you drive were first a desire, then believed into being. Now let's zone in here. All prophets believe it does, and in ages of imagination. I like that, ages of imagination. That was our title of our discussion in relation to Neville Goddard a few weeks ago. Now, as I had mentioned, this really is believing in our mind's eye as the true eye, which allows us to look beyond past experiences, which may represent themselves in the five sensory experience, to actually realize that the evidence or facts, we could say, are found first in imagination before they are expressed. So how does this relate when it comes to relationships, dealing with others? Well, let me share a personal story. In 2009, when I had started my IT business, I had a hunch or an inspiration to reach out and connect to someone on Facebook. This individual was running a meetup group for individuals in Toronto who were running businesses, entrepreneurs meetup group. But something felt right, as we discussed, feeling is the secret. Something felt right about reaching out to him. Now, I didn't know what was going to happen or how it would play out, but I reached out to him, and we met up for coffee, and we spoke about what services we were offering. He was building certain kinds of websites for certain industries, and I was providing technical services for small offices and businesses in Toronto. So we worked out a referral program. Now, what ended up happening was, a little while after, he called me, and he said, there is a client that's an hour or so up north, a steel company, that's looking for IT services. Would you be interested? So I accepted, went over there, performed the services that they required. They gave us more work, so much that I had to hire my first contractor. And upon building that relationship with the owner of that business, they introduced me to their accountant, who was observing how we were relating with everybody in the office, as well as the owner, and the level of satisfaction that they were having from the services. And from there, the conclusion was, let's bring him and his team in to do service for us in my small office with my small team, IT services. What ended up happening was she opened up her connections to me. She ended up connecting me with so many people, and they ended up connecting me with so many people, and the referrals kept piling on. So much so that at one point I said, look, you got to slow down with the referrals. And I had to say that actually with others that I was doing the service for, and my team was doing the service for. This demonstrates the power of relationships. And I felt in those stages, that was 2009, I was still learning what I understand right now to a deeper degree. But I felt that I understood it by coming across the information from Think and Grow Rich, which encourage certain thinking patterns in relation to others. This information brought me to The Power of the Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy, and other information that indicated the same thing, which Neville articulates really well here, which I infuse in our conversation today. And I would like this to be relatable for all types of relationship, not just in the business realm, personal realm, and so forth. He says, if you desire change in your relationship, at home or in business, you don't argue, you don't persuade them. So can I persuade myself that you are as I desire to see you? Then to the degree that I can persuade myself, you will conform in the outer world to that persuasion. If I hope to see changes there before I myself will start the changes on the inside, the chances are I will hope in vain. So it's thinking patterns in regards to relationships, and more specifically, thinking patterns in regards to rejection or lack of acceptance when it comes to others that we want to make peace with. Now, some might find this easier to simply assume that people from this day onwards see them in an ideal way. They can bring forth that level of self-persuasion to such a degree. This would indicate somebody that is, we could say, more trusting in their imagination. They recognize and they feel. Feeling is the secret. The idea of what is true in imagination as the source of what expresses itself as the outer expressions of mind, reality. As I had mentioned in the recent videos, they recognize the mind's eye as the true eye that looks beyond, let's say, past interpretations that seem to play out as theater, which we call rejection, recognizing that it's our interpretation in relation to that brings forth reactivity, brings us into different states of mind, and expresses accordingly. So thus, we can benefit then from making peace with our thinking patterns. Now let's tie this into some of the work from William Walker Atkinson, which I brought up a couple times in the recent videos. I'll put in the link in the description to those videos. He talks about suggestion. So knowing that we, within ourselves, are the only suggestors, we can suggest how we experience people to ourselves and observe how people change towards us, how we change towards them. Everything down from how we communicate, what we say, our body language, voice tonality, how those aspects are presented from them to us, and everything in between, which we can call unknown. Although we know many aspects as far as communication goes, we still want to keep an open mind that there are aspects that we have not understood yet we will continue to understand as we evolve in this existence of understanding the nuances of communication. One does not need to know those things, They simply need to understand how they got this thinking pattern in the first place and use the same ways that it was stimulated in their subconscious mind via persuasion and apply that to self-persuasion in relation to, so they could see themselves a certain way in which it's easier for them to make conversations with people. It's easier for them to make a proposition or work a deal. It's easier for them to initiate a relationship and set clear criteria for that relationship. And they find it natural and expressive because we are operating in this regard from the degree of love, which is how people truly are, as we discussed last week. And thus are able to easily build those relationships because we are being true and authentic to how we really are, representing love, and others show up based on that self-persuasion to play out the theater representation of that love, such as the case with my example. Now, keep it in consideration, I had mentioned earlier that I was still learning in that phase, but I feel like I understand this stuff even more so every day. That's the beautiful thing about working with this information. And so we will further elaborate on this one point. The repetition of the same information, which is in harmony and in contribution to your goals and visions, and more specifically put, how you truly desire to be in relationship with others, in relation to others. And this applies to circumstances, information, environments, etc., everything. All of this can be changed within. We have the ability to change it all within ourselves via suggestion. Now, William Walker Atkinson categorizes and says there are 5 classes of suggestions. Let's go through these. I had discussed them in detail in the videos. I recommend watching those videos. So this is how we get suggestion within ourselves in relation to others. Number 1, suggestion of authority. Suggestion by authority manifests both in the positive authoritative statements directed to the point, and also by the spoken or written statements made by those who speak or write with an air of authority. And we're talking about perceived authority here. It's perception. When we perceive someone as authority, I recommend reading Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. Perhaps when a person got rejected when they had a conversation with someone or they proposed a deal, someone else suggested how they should interpret that particular experience. Oh, the person doesn't want to deal with you because you're not good enough, and so forth. Now, we're heightened in our consciousness enough that we recognize that those are thinking patterns that, although they had appeared from the external, the interpreter from within suggested them to be a certain way in relation to the self-image, and thus we started to go around believing that other people wouldn't accept us for who we are. Suggestion of association. He says, it is very easy for us to associate certain things with other things, and we will find that when one of the things is recalled, it will bring forth its associated impressions. So a person got rejected at an earlier stage of their life. Maybe they wanted to have a conversation with someone, and the person didn't go on a date with them or something like that. And their friends started laughing at them and said, look, you're a loser and whatever else. These are thinking patterns that the person starts to believe. They were not aware to the degree of that those are opinions, and they don't have to accept those opinions. So now they're forming associations when it comes to people. People don't accept me in a broad scale. If I communicate with people, if I reach out and build relationships with people, others will laugh at me. They look around to see what others are doing in relation to where they are before they start the conversation with the person. They literally look around to see if others are looking at them before they start the conversation with the person. Now, not to shame ourselves or condemn ourselves. If we have these thinking patterns within ourselves, we've just formed it through perhaps suggestion of association. Bringing awareness on how this programming got in there in the first place allows us to make peace with it and change it. And from there, allows us to easily accept the suggestion that the self-persuasion of how we see others to be reflects accordingly, like it always did, and it continues to do so. Number 3, the suggestion of habit. He says the suggestion of habit, the form of suggestion, is closely allied to the preceding phase, suggestion of association. In fact, some consider it to be merely a branch of the latter. But we feel that there is a decided difference in the operation of the two phases, and accordingly prefer to treat this one as forming a separate and distinct phase. Of course, all habit is an association with something in the past, but suggestion of habit may arise from an original cause of suggestion of authority, suggestion of association, suggestion of repetition, suggestion of imitation, or else from an original decision of the intellect resulting from correct reasoning. The former act or thought acts as a suggestive outside influence, although it belongs to one's own mentality. So essentially, the habitual process of constantly seeing ourselves from the perspectives of what we identified with, either through the suggestion of authority or suggestion of association or in combination, forming in repetition through how we relate to the rejection, forming a habit of thinking pattern, thus forming a self-image. And so we have suggestion of repetition. The suggestion of repetition is a form of suggestion which may seem to be very much akin to the preceding phase, suggestion of habit, but there is a marked distinction and difference. Suggestion of habit has its power imparted to it by the habitual repetition of the act or thought on the part of the individual, while suggestion of repetition gains its power by the repetition of a suggestion from some outside object or person. It is the constant dripping of water wearing away the stone. A suggestion passes you without much attention or consideration. When first made, will gain both attention and consideration from you, if it be repeated sufficiently often and in the right manner. And so we see this in advertising. We see this in perhaps certain conversations that seem to play out again and again and again in our environments. We want to be aware of these information pieces, and more specifically put, how we relate to these information pieces. As I had mentioned many times, you can change how you relate to something, you could accept it the way it is, or you could change it. Place yourself in the environments and in the masterminds and in the conversations with others that encourage you to think accurately, to think from the perspective of love, which is all people accept you, and you accept all people. Now, this might be a polarizing statement for some, and that's okay, because many polarizing statements, once made peace with from the perspective of, let's say, the polarizing to reactivity, as in this can't be true, through the repetition of suggestion and autosuggestion from either the same information or the same information from different perspectives, it becomes the way it is. And so let's go back to the beginning here to emphasize. Neville states, if you desire a change in your relationships at home or in business, you don't argue, you don't persuade them. So if a person gets rejected or experiences, more accurately put, self-condemnation, interpretations from the past in relation to suggestions of authority, association, habit, repetition in regards to the experience with another person, what usually ends up playing out, and we see this, is the person starts arguing with the other person, trying to convince the other person, trying to strong-arm the other person in a business deal and so forth. We want to let go of that and go back to what was said here. So can I persuade myself that you are as I desire to see you? Then to the degree that I can persuade myself, you will conform in the outer world to that persuasion. If I hope to see changes there before I myself will start the change on the inside, the chances are I will hope in vain. We fight against the reflections on the screen of space rather than changing the source within ourselves, recognizing the inward eye as the eye of truth. And so we see them how they truly are from the perspective of love. And so if you see them for how they truly are, which is how you see yourself from the perspective of love, what then is the meaning of rejection other than, here's what I could do next time? In sales, this is something that we teach. It's called overcoming objections. And although it may seem on the surface very tactical, in regards to this conversation, it comes from a deep place. And your goal is to help them understand how their pains, their desires, their frustrations, and the challenges that they're dealing with can be resolved via the benefits of your product or service. See, the key is that people like to do business with who they like and trust. We know this. If you study direct response marketing, consultative selling, or copywriting, you'll see this is one of the common themes in there. And that the rejection actually is a door opener in this regard. So we're changing our perspective in regards to certain programming that a person may unconsciously, this is through the repetition in the subconscious mind. That's why I recommend working with the power of the subconscious mind. So now we got suggestion of imitation. The suggestion of imitation. This form of suggestion, while being in itself a distinct phase of suggestion, nevertheless has a very close relationship with the several other forms of suggestion. In the acceptance of the suggestion of authority, there is to be found an unconscious imitation of the mental attitude of the person asserting the authority. In suggestion of association, there is an imitation of the associated thing. And in suggestion of repetition, there is to be found evidence of imitation. Examples are found in schools of philosophies, theories, thought, and religion. So, if certain schools of thought seem to encourage certain thinking patterns, that you are not good enough, that you are not worthy, that people don't accept you the way you are, and you're hearing this over and over again from different people, different perspectives in regards to repetition, habit, association, authority, it's easier then to draw the obvious conclusion that this is why a person prevents themselves. They're the ones preventing themselves from starting the conversation, proposing the deal, initiating the relationship, and building the relationship to have the various experiences that a person can have, the enriching experiences in life as a result of healthy relationships. And as I had mentioned, this is not just true for the business world. We're talking about personal life, family life, friendship, all areas of our life. We live in a fascinating time today in relation to the age of imagination. Technology has made it easier for us to connect with more people that are like us. Now, in regards to that, we can go out and start conversations, we can reach out to people and so forth, but why is it a person has challenging within themselves? Well, it's the programming. So let's talk about the next form of suggestion. By autosuggestion, it's meant the application of principles of suggestion by oneself upon oneself. In autosuggestion, the individual plays a dual role of suggester and suggestee, respectively. In all other respects, it's precisely the same as suggestion in its general phases. Autosuggestion, as the term is generally applied, we voluntarily select and choose the suggestions which we wish to impress us, and we add to their effect by repetition and attention. But in both suggestion and autosuggestion, the principle employed is precisely the same. The autosuggestions are designed to feel the reality of the idea, lightheartedly transcendent to certain thinking patterns in relation to suggestions of authority, association, habit, repetition, and imitation that are not true and in harmony for how you truly are, which is a representation of love and seeing others from that perspective as well. Then we understand what he meant here when he said, all prophets believe it does, and in ages of imagination, a firm persuasion moved mountains. But many today are not capable of a firm persuasion of anything. Why is that? Because of the perpetuation of certain thinking patterns, we call that programming, that seems to be spread out and encouraged. We call that the world of Caesar-based programming. And we want to let go of it. We want to have nothing to do with it, unless you want to have something to do with it. And find the true and distinct thinking patterns within yourself and self-suggest those thinking patterns. So let's have a conversation then about rejection. Perhaps this conversation will stimulate some ideas for autosuggestions, which when applied will allow us to release from these thinking patterns, which will allow us to see people for how they really are, which is from the perspective of love. Thus, seeing them from the perspective of love, we'll find it easier to initiate the conversations, propose the deals, initiate the relationships, grow the relationships in a mutually harmonious way. Benefit for you, benefit for others, benefit for divine and evolution. See, when it comes to reaching out and connecting with people, building relationships with people, when we see them from the place of love, when we see ourselves from the place of love, the theater plays out as it should, as I mentioned. Sometimes we work a deal, sometimes you get some reference experience, sometimes you get some optimization data, sometimes you get a referral, sometimes they open up a door for you, or sometimes, and I've seen this many times, you run into them again a year or two later, and they want to do business with you. And another way of looking at it is, you could say, rejection brings forth this clarity within ourselves. By taking a step in that direction of initiating the conversation, we develop a higher degree of clarity. We allow our authenticity to express. Now, the power behind this, for those that are interested in, we could say, putting themselves out there on social media, creating content, putting out videos on YouTube, this can be very helpful. Because one of the reasons why people procrastinate is because of this thinking patterns within themselves in relation to rejection when it comes to others. And this to me is an indication of a person not trusting the reality of their imagination. No need to shame ourselves. Simply reflect upon the thinking patterns in relation to and see it for how it truly is. People accept you for who you are. There are more people that want to hear what you have to say. There are people that relate to you in your life experiences, and they genuinely want to hear them. These are the individuals that you'll build relationships with because they feel the same way you do. They perhaps have gone through the same experiences that you have once gone through, and it's very beneficial for them. It's helpful. And a lot of times we'll find is that perhaps in the earlier stages, I remember when I first started doing the speed reading workshops for iris reading in 2010, it felt uncomfortable, but from the repetition, again, the autosuggestion based repetition, both from the inner dialogue, because the autosuggestions are inner dialogues in relation to these experiences, in relation to as well the experiences, and upon reflection of the experiences, to realize that it was becoming more so like the autosuggestion, what I noticed, it would become easier to the point where if I was looking to do one next weekend, I would just do it. It really does feel that way. If I felt like reaching out to someone, I just do it. As a matter of fact, I talk to people wherever I am. In the airport, in the elevator, I talk to them. Whereas back in the days, I would have all these thinking patterns that would be brought forth in relation to disconnect. And then the thinking patterns would play out in how they would relate to me and how I would relate to them. It's all suggestions that I had learned, which I had unconsciously identified with, and I no longer identify with those thinking patterns. I identify with the thinking patterns of seeing people for how they truly are, which is in harmony and in contribution to my vision, and I am in harmony and in contribution to their vision from the perspective of love. And even another way of looking at this is it really so that they think we're not good enough? Is it really so that people don't accept us? Or is it our own thinking patterns in relation to how we see others? By asking a simple question like that, we bring ourselves to the conclusion that it is ourselves, within ourselves, suggesting to ourselves, and thus imagining things to be a certain way. So what about fear? Well, a lot of that fear when it comes to relationships has to do with thinking patterns that we have formed as a result of the opinions of others in relation to the experience, identifying with certain thinking patterns, which we can call limiting or disempowering, creating unnecessary associations within ourselves in relation to others based on certain experiences, and through the repetition of perhaps finding ourselves in those experiences in which we connect with each other. After we connect with them, we say, look, it doesn't work out. People always treat me this negative way or whatever. And we, through the suggestion of habit and repetition, continue to reinforce that. And because we recognize that the inner expresses as the outer, we automatically find ourselves in certain schools of thought in which that kind of programming seems to be encouraged. So the source is still within ourselves. We can find it within ourselves. We can change it within ourselves, such as some of the examples that I gave earlier in regards to rejection. And we can bring it down to the truth of the matter, is that love is the essence. How can love be rejected? I always say this. What you desire desires you back. What you love is yours. If we have resistance to those kinds of thinking patterns, then perhaps some of the conversations that we've been having in regards to thinking patterns, and specifically today, in regards to rejection or not being accepted, which we accept ourselves within, and one cannot experience the interpretations in regards to life experience that we would label as rejection from the perspective of I'm not good enough and so forth. The deal goes through, you get the referral, you get the optimization data, and you just do it here and there. It just happens automatically. This is exactly the kind of experience that I noticed happen with me when it came to being on the entrepreneurial journey since 2009, is rejection doesn't have that same meaning as it did in the earlier stages. Because just through the repetition of thinking accurately from the perspective of love in relation to the experiences, those things change, and then it's easier to accept people for how they are and actually see them experience from that perspective. And then what we see is everywhere we go, people seem to want to connect with us, do business with us, build relationships with us, hang out with us, and so forth, because it is a firm persuasion, way of being, a self-image, a way of life. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. Let's go ahead and conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage the acceptance of ourselves in relation to others, thus having that play out as harmonious relationships. We can say, I recognize more so each day that it is easier for me to accept myself because who I am is love. From the perspective of love, people show up in my experience, revealing the love that is within myself. This plays out as conversations automatically being started. People want to converse with me, I converse with them, and it's easier for me to see the connection of how they relate to me and how I relate to them in a harmonious way, resulting in deals, relationships, and other initiatives that are spawned as a result of my thinking pattern in regards to how I see myself in relation to others from the perspective of love. I realize that love is the law, and all expresses from the law of love as representations of that love. Harmonious relationships in mutually beneficial ways, and interesting life experiences involving others, which I've always desired to experience by seeing them for how they truly are. Thus I understand, then, to the degree that I am self-persuaded, they conform in the outer world to that persuasion, which is based on the reality of seeing people for how they truly are, which is how I see myself, as a representation of love. If you would like a copy of this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.